So we all just read about the creation story, and we all kind of grew up knowing that story. And how I always heard that story and understood that story when I was growing up was there's these two people running around in a garden.
Right.
Adam and Eve are there. No clothes, but that's cool. And in that garden, God's given them a bunch of trees to eat from, but he says, we've learned that there's two trees right smack dab in the middle. One is the tree of life, and they're allowed to eat from that. And the other is the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and they're not allowed to eat from that.
Right. When you were a kid, if you had painted like a picture of that garden, you would have drawn like a square, and in the middle of it, you would have painted some trees, right?
Oh, exactly.
Right.
The vegetable crops would have been on the outside, and then right in the middle is that tree, both those trees. And so that's how I learned it, and I bet that's how most of us would draw it and learn it as well.
Right.
But then I got to seminary, and I learned to see this in an entirely different way, and it blew my mind, and it made this far more profound for me.
I remember when you shared it with me for the first time. It was really, really helpful. I'm excited we're talking about it.
Yeah, I was very excited to share it with people. I'd love to share this part.
Yeah.
So remember, Genesis is written in Hebrew, and so sometimes the way they grammatically put things together, it's not the easiest for us to put together in English. And we just read in, 2, 8, and 9. And it says, in 9, the tree of life was in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that kind of implies that they're right next to each other. That's how we learn that.
Right, our English sounds like there's just these two trees like squeezed together.
Correct.
Right.
But in the Hebrew, what it's really conveying there is the idea of midst. It is attached to the tree of life. And the tree of knowledge of good and evil, it's really not there. It doesn't really have a location.
It's almost written like a there's this clause, and then there's a whole other clause that's
exactly.
like, and there's also this tree.
Exactly. There's a tree of life. It's central.
Right.
It's the focus
right.
point. But this other tree, it's there, but it's just there. Which then, so that's nice in and of itself. But then when you go to what Eve says when she's being tempted, that starts to really shift how you understand what this whole temptation and sin thing is. Because when she's talking to the serpent, what does she say? She says, we're allowed to eat from any tree of the garden except for the tree that's in the middle.
In the center, I think your Bible will translate, right?
Yeah. In the center, in the midst, however it is. But it's this idea that this is the focus point. And the tree for her that's in the middle is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Right.
So all of a sudden, this should change how we understand the idea of sin and the story of Adam and Eve, and it conveys something to us.
Right. One of the phrases that we've started to use to describe this is that Eve had the wrong tree in the center of her garden, right? In a way of talking about it, right? So you have this really clear picture. There's this one tree that's in the center, and that's the tree of life. And then there's also this other tree that's somewhere in the garden, location undisclosed.
Correct. And we could almost think of it as not only is it a geographical location, but it's just the central focus. What is everything centered around?
Right, because Genesis isn't trying to map like some, cartography moment for the Garden of Eden. And so what you have is when the serpent asks Eve the question, like, did God really say this? And she says, well, he said that if we eat of the tree in the center of the garden, we'd surely die. So for the original here, that would have flagged back, right?
Absolutely.
Immediately to that first chapter.
And wait a minute.
Or second chapter,
that's
sorry.
Not the one that's supposed to be in the middle of the garden.
Right. And they would have been like, but God said that the tree in the middle of the garden is the garden of life. And now when Eve's talking, the tree she's referencing in the center is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And that should make us pause.
Absolutely.
Right. And the thing that we walk away with, like, how would you articulate that?
So what I would say is what's happening here is, again, it's the focus. It's what is your heart centered on? What is at the center of your heart? Is it the idea of a tree of life where you're constantly engaging in the full life of what God intended for you? Or is your heart centered on this other tree, this knowledge of good and evil, this thing that God has said, you don't need to worry about that. Just engage with me.
Right.
But it's the other thing that she's placed at the center of her focus in her heart.
Which is something that's really important for each of us to think through, wrestle with, and I love that there's that practical application there. What's really fascinating here, though, is think of us as Christians. Most of us, when we think of like, when did things go wrong in that garden story, right? Like, when did the bad moment happen?
When she picked the apple and ate it.
Exactly. We immediately go to, she ate the fruit and then he ate the fruit with her. That's the bad moment. And what you hear, and we skip this whole piece, but what you see actually starting to happen here in the earliest moments of this story already is that something is migrated in Eve's heart where she is no longer putting her faith and trust in God. And she's starting to have the wrong tree placed at the center of her garden. And why this is so important is because that means something's starting to break something's going wrong, something is not good, right? All of chapter 1, it was good, it was good, it was good, it was good. Something here, though, is already not good, and no fruit has been eaten yet. And that means there's something there that's really important for us to wrestle with.
Yes.
Years ago, I got really sick, like uniquely sick. I hadn't been this sick really ever. And so it was like a flu had happened, and I'd gotten that, and I'd been wrestling with that. And then it just didn't go away. And it kept getting more and more aggravating. That's the best way to put it. I was really fed up and frustrated. I don't know if you've ever been sick like that. So I had a runny nose, and I had a headache, and I had chest congestion, and I was coughing, and all of those things. And I just finally was like, I'm done. I need to take care of this. And so I went to the drugstore. I went to like Walmart, CVS, Walgreens, whatever. And I walked in. I'm like, I need to get an expectorant, right? To loosen up the mucus that's in my lungs. Yes, I know it's a gross word, but that's what it was. I need to get an antihistamine. I need to get a decongestant to stop the runny nose. I'd love a pain reliever to stop the headache and some of the other pieces that are going. And so I walked out of there with like an arsenal of, like home remedy, or an arsenal of medicine, more or less, to basically say, I need to treat all of these things. Why? Because I want it to go away, because I'm tired of dealing with this, because I want my life back. I want to step into work and life and family and all the things and do that. So I started taking it. And in a few days, it got worse. And after like 5 days, it was a lot worse. And I just was like, what? I finally I'm doing all these things. Why isn't it going away? So I went to the doctor, and the doctor was like, well, let's take a look. And I told him, I'm here's what I'm taking. I'm taking this and this and this, and I'm taking all this stuff. And he did an x-ray, and he came back in. He goes, Ryan, you have bacterial pneumonia. And he's like, that's not going to go away until you treat it at the source. Meaning, if you don't take an antibiotic to start actually treating this thing, you're going to be dealing with the symptoms all day long, and it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. And I learned a few things from that moment. One of the things that I learned was I need to go to a doctor earlier. That seems like it would be sound medical advice, so that I can take care of those things before they become that problematic. But the other thing that I learned is that in our lives, and I mean this across the board, we've got to realize that if all we ever do is treat the symptoms of something, and there's a deeper underlying issue, that whatever that underlying issue is that's causing those symptoms is just going to compound and keep going. In fact, most of the time, it's even going to get worse. And I think of this when it comes to spirituality. I think of this when it comes to how we live and walk our faith. And in particular, I think of this when it comes to sin. So often, what you'll hear around here as a church is this idea that sin is a symptom. And I don't say that to downplay sin. Sin's hard, and it's bad, and it causes havoc in our lives and the lives of others, and creates relational discord and pain and all kinds of stuff. So is it good? No, of course not. But in terms of how we think about dealing with it, we look at it as where sin is a symptom. What often happens is there's an underlying issue within us, and maybe there's a fear, maybe there's a hurt, an insecurity, a struggle, maybe there's shame. I don't know what it might be for each person, but I know there's things there. And out of those things that exist in us that have taken root in our heart, or that have shifted in our minds and hearts, they start to produce these behaviors in our lives because we form bad strategies to adapt to those things. We choose ways other than that which God would have for us or what he created us to be. And this is what creates sin around us. So if all we do is treat the symptoms, we ignore the underlying problem, which if you've ever struggled with something for a really long time, you know that you knew better, that you wanted to stop, that you didn't like this thing in your life, but something in you kept bringing you back to that place in the first place. You've got to deal with the underlying thing. And that's where real change happens. We see this with Adam and Eve even. I would love to, go and say, like, stop it, or just treat this moment, like, don't do this type of a thing. But the reality is, there was an underlying thing that was occurring in Eve long before she ever got to the tree in the first place. Think about her conversation with the serpent. He says some really key things to her. He says, did God really say? Meaning, can you really trust God? And all of a sudden, her faith and her heart and what she centers herself in begins to shift. No, you're not going to die. In fact, what's actually going to happen is you're going to become like God. And all of a sudden that begins to think of the insecurity there. Wait, is God holding out on me? Am I little? Am I less than? Could I be more than I am right now? Like, is he lying to me? Have I been deceived here? All of these pieces, these fears and insecurities and stuff start to creep in. And that leads her step by step up to the trunk of a tree as she reaches for a piece of fruit that she never would have grabbed had these things not taken root in her lives in the first place. This is the thing that we have to wrestle with. If all we do is treat the symptoms, we're going to find ourselves going to the same tree again and again and again. So when I was a kid, the story that I was most familiar with in the Bible, outside of the Gospels or the life of Jesus, was Adam and Eve.
Of course.
Right, and it's just because I grew up. If you grew up in Sunday school, you probably have a moment, and I'm sure you have this where we did the flannel graphs and the animals and all just the garden, all the things. So I was super familiar with that. So here's the funny thing about it is I found myself at one point in time wanting to go back. And if you're wondering, wanting to go where, back to the garden. So I grew up watching Back to the Future was popular when I was a kid.
Classic.
Yeah, it was a really good movie.
Holds up well.
Right. And so I just had this thought, in my lifetime, they're going to invent a time machine. It's going to happen. And so my friends and I would all be like, so the question, if you could go back in a time machine, where would you go back to? And they would all be like, oh, I want to go back to see the Roman era. That sounds so cool. Or I want to go back to this moment and see this. For everybody else would have this there's this really cool thing I want to go back to, or maybe it was even a favorite moment of their last year or something. They would be like, I want to go back to that best thing that ever happened to me. For me, I would actually say when I go back, I'm gonna go to Adam and Eve in the garden, and I was sincere about this. I genuinely was like, I want to go back.
I know you're not asking me, but I'm going to tell you, if I were to go back a place, it would be when the McRib is still on the McDonald's menu.
Oh, that's disgusting. I'm sorry for your internal organs.
Anyways, you'd go back to the garden.
So, yeah, I wanted to go back to the garden. And so I just had this thought. And here's literally how I would envision this in my head. I was like, I would think of myself as I get out of the time machine and then I'm in the garden and I go running across the garden and Eve's maybe picking the fruit and she's about to eat it. Mm-hmm. And I'd run up to her and be like, no. And I'd smack the fruit out of her hand. And then I'd turn to Adam and I'd take the fruit out of his and I'd chuck it. And I'd be like, no. And I would save the world. Because to me, it was that simple. If everything was good and then it wasn't because they ate some fruit, and we all need to pay the piper for this.
Not fair.
Right? We're all now suffering and struggling and making poor decisions and all kinds of things because of this. I just had this thought, if I could just go back and smack the fruit out of their hands, I'd change it all. And that is what I wanted to do. I did. In fact, I think I was kind of influenced by this. I lived a lot of my life this way for a while, thinking this is what we all needed to do. And the crazy part is, so if you're sitting here going, that's kind of a sweet childish story, and I get it, and it makes sense. It's not actually a sweet childish story. And the reason why is we do this all the time, more often than what we know. I think for us as Christians, there's a part where we may not be getting in a time machine to go back type of a moment, but I really think we think that the way we should deal with things is if I could just smack the fruit out of somebody else's hand, I'll stop the problem. Right? If I can just what's the Bob Newhart video that you all hopefully just watched, where he's like, if we could just say,
stop it.
Exactly. Then all of this, this will work. If you're a parent and you've looked at your kids and you're like, they just need to know what's wrong and they need to stop it. And that's going to change it. Or you look at an adult who's frustrating you. I need to tell them this is wrong and they need to stop it and it's going to change it. And I've just realized over time.
Well, I've literally told my kids to stop it. And,
me too.
And they didn't.
And part of that's developmentally appropriate. Yeah. Kids need to learn. I just think we do this forever.
Yep.
Right? We do this as adults. And I think we can live our lives running around trying to smack apples out of people's hands. But what good does that do when they're actually dealing with a deeper problem that brought them to the tree in the first place? They're going to find a way to another apple. One of the things that was most impactful for me is I started working in the substance abuse community, and people would do all of this extraordinary work because they knew the drug they were taking was wrong or the alcohol they were abusing was wrong.
They were wanting to stop.
Yeah, they're like, I need to stop this. Yeah. And they'd stop using that drug, and then it was so incredibly common for them to start using a different one.
Because?
The same thing, the thing inside them that was driving them to that tree in the first place to use that substance to cope, hadn't been resolved yet, and they were still after something to mitigate it. Like they were still trying. And it's not me saying so it's okay and we just, it's all hard. It's all complicated. Here's the point is until we start dealing with the deeper issues in people's lives that are bringing them to the behaviors that are sin, that are causing them to eat that fruit, we just find ourselves in this endless loop of pointing the finger.
Absolutely. And it's really important to me that we also reflect on the fact that as much as we do this to other people, we also do this to ourselves.
Yeah, that's true.
And that we will sit there and we'll do everything we can to try and stop something. And we'll either stop that but move on to something else, or we just fail. And we haven't had the opportunity to really just look deeply within ourselves and say, what's the thing that's at the center of my focus, at the center of my heart, that's leading me to this?
Right.
And then there are times where we say, what am I supposed to do? How do I change that?
Right.
And
because those are kind of scary questions or big questions or hard, right? Yeah.
It's terrifying when you actually realize maybe what it is at the center of your heart. And
Right.
what do I do to change that? I know a lot of people, probably you all, are saying, okay, well now tell us how we do
what's
that.
the thing? What do I need to change?
Yeah.
That's the number one conversation I end up having with people out of this. And what's interesting is it's different for everybody.
Sure.
Because I don't know what it is that you are wrestling with in here. But the good news is Jesus does. And the good news is you can partner with him. This isn't us saying like, so don't smack fruit and now just deal with your deep stuff. And it's not that. It's saying you can actually turn to a God who loves you. You can partner with him in faith. He wants to love you and meet you right where you are. And as you walk with him, seeking to be loved by him, love yourself, love others along the way, right? Just that same thing. What's going to happen here is he's going to work on that with you. And you're going to find that the energy inside you that brings you to that tree again and again and again starts to go down. And the behavior starts to change as you become to look more and more like the person of Jesus Christ, which is what we call spiritual growth, right? Like that's a huge part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that just to add to that, one of the biggest things is understanding when we talk about trust and faith in Christ, like that whole trust and faith is that he's actually going to work in me. I don't know how, or he's going to guide me to some place, and trying to figure out the steps in front of that before he does that. That's what causes pain and
right.
frustration.
You get to walk with him. We don't always know, but we get to walk and he'll take us there. One of the things that I think is really challenging, but also really encouraging is when Christ entered into our existence, right? When Jesus was born into this world, everything in me thinks, okay, he's going to go start smacking fruit out of people's hands too.
Just a baby smacking.
Right? Or even as he gets old. I love that everybody imagines him as a baby. But as he gets older too, like when he starts his ministry, I'm going to think he's going to walk around being like, stop it, stop it, stop it. And but that's actually not the way you see him live out his ministry. No. What does he do? He meets people where they are. And all of their fear about what's wrong with them, he loves them where they are. He invites them into relationship with himself, and then they either walk with him, or, and what we see modeled in the greatest possible way with Jesus, is he dies for them. He loves them to the point of giving his own life, making them new, and giving them life with him. And that's our path forward. So if you I just want you to know that's the greatest gift for you. And if you find yourself encouraged by that, the next time you look around your world and you find yourself tempted to go, I'm going to go smack the fruit out of everyone else's hands. I'm going to be the person who keeps yelling, stop it. I just want you to engage this world the same way that Christ has loved you, by loving it forward, meeting the people in your life where they are one step at a time, and trusting to walk with him in faith as he unfolds the things he wants to wrestle with and do in you. And friends, you'll be in good hands.